Hello, innovators. I'm Todd Weyandt, and welcome to the Bridging the Gap podcast presented by Applied Software. You're invited to join our MEP and construction innovation adventure with a mission to propel this great industry forward. My guest today is Ryan Lean. He serves as associate partner at JB&B and leads the JB&B Field, incorporating 10 specific field-related services into one comprehensive service offering. Outside the firm, Ryan currently serves as president of the International Board of the Building Commissioning Association. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with how you got into the construction industry to begin with.
Oh boy. So like I'm sure many others, just you go all the way back to high school, I guess. And you're talking with guidance counselors and you're going through kind of what your career is going to look like and what you should study when you get shipped off to the university. And for me, it was engineering. So I didn't know that necessarily I liked engineering per se. It was kind of the math and science type scores that led me down that path. Although I guess if you go back early childhood, I was programming software on Commodore 64s for those of you who remember them. But certainly I said programming is not for me. I like the built environment. And so, after school, it's interesting. I graduated at a dark time in our country in May of 2001. And so when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do and kind of was collecting my thoughts and looking at everything in front of me, 9/11 happened and kind of everything in the country paused and all of the offers that I had been rescinded. So then it's starting at square one, trying to figure out what to do. I was lucky enough, and I say lucky because I mean it, to join a small firm that focused on building commissioning. I will tell you now, as the president of the Building Commissioning Association, I had no idea what commissioning was. And I'm sure we'll get into it in the podcast that there's plenty of people that still have no idea what commissioning is.
Yeah.
But I really got lucky because it took the technical aptitude and all the things and the math and science that you studied in the university. And then it made it practical for me, right? So that you got your boots dirty and your hands dirty and you're in the field and you're trying to make things work. And at the core of what commissioning is, that's really what it is, trying to make sure that the performance of facilities, the operation of facilities are kind of as they were supposed to be intended. So I got lucky to kind of jump into that. And after a couple of years, in a smaller firm, wanted to get a broader scope of experience from the design perspective as well. So not just jumping into the field, without kind of understanding conceptually how things are supposed to operate before you're marking them off as not operating properly. So I got my background in design, got my professional licenses, all that good stuff. And then I said, you know what, let's get back in the field. And so I've been doing that pretty much ever since.
Yeah, nice. So you mentioned that there's some confusion around commissioning and stuff. What do you find is some of the biggest misconceptions that the industry really has regarding commissioning?
Yeah, I think the answer is simple for me, at least. The biggest misconception around commissioning is that it's just functional testing, meaning showing up at the end of the project, looking at what's physically in front of you, and then just quote unquote testing the equipment, whatever that means. So just to take a step back again and remind all the listeners kind of what the definition of commissioning is. I think a lot of folks should be familiar with ASHRAE, heating and refrigeration. So ASHRAE Guideline 0 defines commissioning. It's kind of like the most accepted definition of commissioning. And that is a quality-oriented process for achieving, verifying, and documenting the performance of facilities, all the assemblies and systems, meet the design intent and the owner's project requirements. So what does that mean? That's a whole lot of words. That's kind of confusing at its core. Basically, what it means is that what's on paper, what's on the documents, what the designers put forth, the architects, the engineers, et cetera, is actually what's built and how it's supposed to operate in the field. And, coming into this industry, maybe a little, I would say, just unaware of what was going around. You just assume that the building is built exactly to the specs and conditions that are on paper, but we know in reality it's not always the case. And there's a lot of instances. It's not because people aren't necessarily doing their job, et cetera, but it's because real life things come into play. There's budget, there's schedules, there's misunderstandings, et cetera. So the Building Commissioning Association, all of the commissioning providers out there, they're trying to kind of overlay this quality assurance process, that goes so far as to confirm that it's in compliance with the documents, right? So like, think of a car, right? Think of a car. Now imagine instead of building a car in the factory where the cars get built, in one single factory, now you're taking it and building it in a different place every time. And by the way, no two cars are alike, right? So now you're building a car in a new place every time. No two of them are alike, right? And so everyone has their own tasks. Someone has to do the brakes, someone has to do the engine, someone has to do the steering, someone has to do the tires, right? And then everybody individually is saying, done, check. I checked the boxes, everything's good, brakes work, engine works, steering works, right, et cetera. But now, like, who's bringing it all together, right? So does the odometer kind of change? Does the needle move when you're driving? Does the music get lower as you're slowing down? Can you lower one window or many windows at a time, right? And so like the integration of your phone now, right? Smart technology in the cars, right? So now think of all that. And if it wasn't really happening in a building, because basically, if you think years ago, that's basically what was happening. You were putting these pieces of equipment in a building, and everyone was individually checking them, as they were going in. But from a system-wide integration, who's looking at everything? And that's really what at the core of commissioning it is. It's that process of even getting in early, reviewing the design, witnessing as it's installed, going through another third party on the submittals, et cetera. So it's bringing it all together, which is so important because you think of anything else that's really manufactured, and buildings are so custom. If you don't have kind of a single source looking at everything, it's very difficult to manage. So from the misconception, and you think of all of that I kind of described, that goes into, any single project. It's not just showing up at the end and making sure that the brakes work or the tires turn or whatever. It's throughout the entire manufacturing process and kind of touching all those different facets, that it's hard to argue with the value proposition.
Yeah. So how do you go about that and kind of integrating the commissioning thing, which is, mentally kind of, at the end of the process? How do you go about integrating that throughout and having, so it's more a seamless thing that when you get to the commissioning phase, there's already been some communication and integration to make that process a little smoother. Does that make sense?
It does. And so there's like anything else. So commissioning is the difficult part of it is it's invisible, right? Because it's the human factor and it's the process that's happening. So as owners and developers start to understand the value proposition of bringing someone in early, catching things on drawings versus catching them after they're purchased, procured, and delivered. Coordination issues in the field and deficiencies that we're going to find, picking them up as we're going on versus at the end, then it's an easier discussion. But I will say there's certain huge influencers that have helped us over time, like the USGBC and the LEED, green buildings rating system, right? Commissioning is a prerequisite, and that's changed over time, the different things that are required. But that certainly set the tone. Now you're talking 15 plus years ago when that was incorporated as a requirement. So, and it said, you need to come in the spec writing phase, right? In the DD phase. So that was really critical. And there's some owners and clients who totally are on board and see the value like that. And there's other, potential people that we deal with that, want to do the minimum, whatever the energy code is telling you to do, or other things. So it's not always easy. I'll tell you, still now doing this for the last 20 years, it's still kind of all over the place. All over the country and all over, each geographical region. But I think for the most part, the value proposition is pretty easy because if you just look at the numbers, and I apologize, I don't have the data in front of me, but the amount of data for an energy efficient building that's commissioned versus not is just, it's off the charts. I can't tell you how many times that I've walked up to call it, any piece of equipment on a job. typically the ones that are hidden in the ceiling somewhere that no one's looking at, and they say it's, we're ready to test, and you go up to it and there's no power to it. I mean, so that means no one's even looking, right? So from that standpoint, it just makes a whole load of sense, to start off at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, what are the trend lines that you're noticing around commissioning, and maybe how has that been impacted it over the last year? Whether that's for the better or a negative impact.
Trend lines for commissioning, like procuring commissioning, or
yeah, just all really all over it. Is there a particular area has it been easier over the last year to get in and be more involved in the process, having kind of that quality control check, or have the hurdles of social distancing and all that stuff kind of made it even more difficult and thrown in more hurdles in it?
Got it. Yeah. So commissioning and technology has helped to a certain extent, but I have said from early in my career till now that commissioning is about people, and it's just there's process, there's technology, but then there's the people that have to deliver. And
Sure.
so I'm still waiting for a building to be dropped by a drone, fully assembled and fully functional. And until that time happens,
It'll be a weird time.
yeah. I mean, until that time happens, I still think commissioning is all about people. And so the processes may change, but to your point about, the latest and through COVID and social distancing and stuff, yet there has to be a way or a happy medium where you're getting hands-on on the systems that you're looking at. And so, trust but verify, we say a lot. So if you're understanding that the systems are calibrated, that they're functioning properly, that you've tested enough of a sample of a certain location, that you're comfortable that everything is functioning properly, then maybe you can do things remotely versus physically, being on site. But that does take a lot to get there, right? You have to have some sort of comfort level that the programming, that the people, that the install is all done properly. But I'll tell you that with COVID, it's interesting because when everyone thinks of commissioning, typically you're drawn to that new building commissioning process. And when we think about construction, you're typically thinking of new buildings out of the grounds, right? Cranes, lifting steel and structure, et cetera. But what we've seen over the last year, at least in the Northeast region, and I imagine it's very similar elsewhere, is that existing portfolio of buildings, which is just massive, at least in the New York City Northeast area. We're seeing a lot of retrofits and a lot of changes. And so it's kind of like, you go back to the car example that I mentioned earlier. It's kind of like, when you commission your new building and you're doing the quality assurance on the car on the manufacturing line before it's set up and rode off into the sunset, don't you once in a while take your car in for a tune-up, get an oil change? Maybe not a Tesla, but you constantly tune it up. You do the oil changes, do the et cetera, right? We need to do the same thing for our building. So what we've seen, because what happens in a building over time, right? You get a cold call and you get a complaint here and there. And, these poor building operators who do an amazing job are running typically with a staff that's less than they should have. So they're running all over the place, trying to make sure that the building is operating, correctly, and they're not getting all these cold complaints, and things change. And then someone goes home, or there's a holiday, or there's a weekend, and set points are always getting changed. You think about in a building, how many set points are there, right? That you have to maintain. So over time, if you look at a baseline from when the building was put up to when it is now, typically that trend line is a little bit different. And what you're trying to do in going into these existing buildings over time and going back into them is you're trying to bring that back up to the baseline, right? So what we've seen over at least the last year is a drop in the new construction, which I think is, basically across the board, but an increase on the existing building portfolio, and trying to make sure, especially with all these different cities that have these new guidelines, some of them penalties for energy usage. And what we're seeing is them, these owners, these developers, these operating facilities managers, trying to make sure they're utilizing their buildings to the most efficient way possible. And that's really kind of looking at all those things and quote unquote, recommissioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Do you see that not really slowing down either, as the commercial real estate game is shifting? And my assumption would be, even the offices that exist now are going to have to be kind of retooled away from the open office environment that it has, or into the hoteling environment potentially. That to me, that would only increase the need for retrofit over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's a whole mix. I read recently about some big companies just forcing their employees to come back and saying this is where the magic happens. And I've seen a whole slew of hybrid arrangements and some of them just going full remote. But I think regardless, what you're definitely going to see is a lot of fit out changes over the next year or two as companies are trying to figure out how they get the staff back. And so that's definitely going to trigger some design changes. That's definitely going to trigger how we're operating. Just from the standpoint of central systems that are distributing air on a given floor just uniformly versus changing that space to, either hot desking hoteling like you're talking about, or requiring personal air for each individual seat versus, a standard terminal unit for many seats versus, eliminating conference rooms and making it open seating. All of those things will trigger, changes in design and therefore, changes in operation for sure.
Yeah. Well, circling back to your trust but verify statement around the technology, when do you, or should you have that confidence in the technology, and are there certain kind of benchmarks that you look for?
Yeah, so sticking with the technology theme, our industry has been notoriously slow to adopt the technology, and you probably know this much better than me, Todd, but especially on the engineering side, mechanical, electrical, and then commissioning side, there hasn't been so many tools. Of recent, it's exponentially gone up. But
Sure.
one thing that's really interesting based on your question is all these new fault detection and diagnostic tools. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because, like you asked, it gives a vision into how your building is operating, and therefore gives you confidence in how the building is supposed to perform. So let me give you an example. Simultaneous heating and cooling. What does that mean? Simultaneous heating and cooling is when you're both heating and cooling in the same system to output a given temperature, right? And so at the end of the day, the user knows nothing about the simultaneous heating and cooling, because if the discharge air temperature is at 55 degrees, let's just say, they're getting their nice, 72-degree room that feels very comfortable, and they're, happy and relaxed. But up in the mechanical room where their air handler is feeding that space, you're now running your heating coil and your cooling coil at the same time. Again, if nobody's looking at this, you're going to have no idea that it's happening. So these fault detection and diagnostic tools are smart technologies that read and understand these rules that say, why are both my heating coil and my cooling coil open at the same time? That's not supposed to happen. Here's my dashboard. Here's a problem. Same thing if you're running, too much electricity, let's just say in the wintertime. Why do you have so much electricity load in the wintertime when all of your heating is coming from hot water, let's just say? Same thing. The interesting part is maybe there's really not a problem, but from the standpoint of saving financial dollars, you have an air handling unit that's supposed to be discharging, let's just say 55 degrees off the coil, and you're discharging 53. Now you say, well, in the grand scheme of things, what's 2 degrees? Doesn't make a big deal. Over the course of a year, you could be talking millions of dollars in utility costs if you have a large enough building and your utility bills are high, which they certainly are in the Northeast. And so having systems like that are so critical, and it honestly blows my mind why this is not a bigger deal, why every facility manager doesn't have one of these tools at their disposal and a dashboard that they're looking at every day, because it's so easy to set up and write these rules, but to your point, all of these systems, these transmitters that are in the building need to be calibrated. You need to be confident that they're operating, the right way, so that the data you're pulling in from these fault detection tools, can be assumed to be, real data. And so, the future technology is exciting. I know that's not, Boston Dynamics robots and stuff like that, but that kind of momentum shift is huge in our industry. And so you can probably, if you have a smart enough mind, find these things on your own. And I can walk around a building, and if I look hard enough, maybe I can find those things. But isn't it nice to have everything talking to a centralized, computer database that's picking up all these different components and spitting out rules and showing me where to focus my time? But again, all of that only works if you go in and check it at the very beginning.
Yeah. So you said that it kind of blows your mind that operators don't have that nice dashboard that they can look at everything and see it all in one spot. Now, what are some of the hurdles in getting to that world where everybody has that nice handy dashboard?
Yeah, it's. I wish I had the answer, because if I had the answer, I would probably double down on that type of work. But I think what it comes down to is, it's new, and just, certain people just are, I guess, fear of the unknown.
Sure.
It also costs money. And as we know, there are budgets and limitations to operating a building of what you have to work with. And so, there are some buildings, and we're talking some of these newer buildings over the last 20 years or so, that have the amount of sensors and transmitters and et cetera, all the hardware necessary in a building to kind of, pull back onto that dashboard. But there's plenty of other buildings that operate just in silos. And, over the last 40 years, there's been patchwork and other things to just build it up. So it's a functional building, but nothing centrally talking to each other. So that's part of it also, because then that would be a much more incremental, exponential cost, I should say, to get it up to speed where a dashboard would be available. And the last reason I would say is the interesting part is we're getting into a time, or maybe we're already there, where cybersecurity is a major concern.
Mm-hmm.
And so anything really that's connected to the internet, that the IoT that could have the potential for a breach, is certainly concerning to a certain amount of clients. Potentially you're putting something on the cloud that someone could get into and then, operate your building or move your elevators or, turn off your outside air to your building or something like that. Of course, these are, doomsday scenarios, but not far from, potential something happening in worst case. So, for all those reasons, and they're all legitimate, cost, security, and kind of the awareness of the unknown. But it's risk reward, and the risk, and the reward in my opinion, with the cost savings and the extra life expectancy on your building, et cetera, in my opinion, far outweighs any sort of risk.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a lot of kind of balancing going on, it seems like, in the commission. What are some of maybe some of your tips for balancing the options and driving the efficiency and effectiveness of the building?
We need to remember that designing an efficient building isn't enough. And we need to remember that building an efficient building, like the construction of it, isn't enough.
Uh,
Just think of the timeline of a building, right? Compare that to the amount of time that the building is operational after it's designed and constructed. So if you think of just the design and construction, you're thinking of anywhere from 1 to 4 to 5 years. And then you think of the life of that building, you could push that out 50 plus years. So we have to think about more than just the design and construction, and more about the life of the building and how it's used. And that's why commissioning is so important. Right? Not only does it set up the baseline for your building when it starts, to make sure you're starting off right, but also part of the commissioning process, like I mentioned at the beginning, not just functional testing, it also includes training of the building operations staff. And why is that so important? Because like I mentioned earlier, no two buildings are alike. They're all unique, right? So training is important because this building may have some sort of special system operations where you're running more efficient chill or lower chilled water than the previous one, or you have smarter technologies and security systems are much more in tune than your previous building. And so the operators that are moving and going into this new building kind of need to understand how to operate that. And that's all, again, part of the handoff, the handshake at the end. It's not, drop the drawings in your lap and say, we're off to the next one.
Mhm.
It's really that connection from handoff to operations. So, hopefully, like I mentioned, the fault detection, et cetera, continuously improving and continuous improvement to monitor that building going forward. And so, I think it's important when you talk about balancing the options in efficiency. And the lead plaque on the wall is excellent and everybody wants it, but you need to maintain that that efficiency, that operation over time. And a lot of the local governments, states, cities, et cetera, they're all picking up on this. And now they're kind of moving towards, penalties for utility consumption over some sort of baseline that they've, selected for your type of building and the size, et cetera. So that's directly related to how you're operating your building. So all of that is kind of part of why, obviously, I get pretty excited about commissioning. Why the whole process is so important, because it's we focus a lot on that initial stage, which is really typically less than 10% of the life of the building, and we should be thinking forward. How do we help our facilities operations teams, et cetera, maintain the building for the life of it?
Yeah, it's interesting. If we look kind of that 5 to 10 year down the road, what do you think has changed in regards to commissioning?
What's changed? So here's here's how I see it. It's more whole building commissioning. So if you look back 20 years, commissioning wasn't around, wasn't a kind of an everyday term, right? And it was solely focused on the HVAC, the mechanical systems. Right. And even 20 years ago, you said, why am I even testing these mechanical systems? Going back to the whole car example, right? I tested my portion of it. Everything works. Let's move on. And so we realized very quickly that, there was a lot of value in commissioning all these HVAC systems. And so now 5 to 10 years down the road, we're going to be laughing about the same thing when it comes to the building envelope. And when it comes to smart technology, like people counters and turnstiles and cybersecurity, there is, I could count on my hand how many people I know that are in the cybersecurity commissioning business. Same thing, by the way, for all the smart devices, but it's going to happen. So that's 5-10 years down the road. When I say whole building commissioning, that's the concept. It's going to be not just the HVAC and the electrical and the fire protection. That's going to be no longer 95% of the building. That may be 60% of the building, with the other 40% picking up a lot of the low voltage items, a lot of the IT networks, like I said, the cyber, the fault detection and predictive kind of analysis we mentioned earlier, both for, energy efficiency and for end of life. And so I think 5-10 years down the road, commissioning will own the whole project from start to finish. If you think of the earlier definition that you're confirming that the building is operating in accordance with the owner's project requirements, like we should own it from the owner's project requirements all the way till acceptance and turnover at the end. Right. So it may be hard to see now for some, but these buildings are becoming more complicated. They're going up faster. There's newer technology, being incorporated into all these buildings. And so I think, there's going to have to be someone that oversees all of that.
Yeah. Interesting. So one of the trends that I'm really curious about is around digital twins. Where do you see that kind of fitting into commissioning over the next few years?
Yeah, I think it's like the fault detection that I mentioned earlier. It's being the adoption is going slower than I would have expected, to be quite honest. But commissioning is going to be a big part of it. So there's the digital twin that has all the records, right? So as you're designing the building, you're incorporating all the records into the digital twin. But beyond that, it's a living, breathing, twin of the building, and therefore it needs to be accurate. So I think the hardest part that we're seeing right now is the data collection. And so right now, the data collection, like the commissioning example with the car, is just scattered with probably 20 different consultants. And that's where I see the most difficult position. And so there are a couple of jobs that I'm involved in, that we're taking on the onus of basically populating the entire database with all the information in the physical building once it starts getting built. Because, again, to be an accurate representation of the building, all the data needs to be accurate for what that is in the building, which could be different from the drawings or the submittals. But it's going to be huge. I mean, right now there's probably, I don't know, you tell me, thousands of, cloud-based software analytics tools that any engineer, architect, owner, developer could use.
Yeah.
The nice part about the digital twin is it should be agnostic enough to kind of pull all of those in together, because I have to imagine it is painful for anyone maintaining, operating a building, to remember all of their logins to the building as opposed to just, their standard banking and shopping websites as well. So the nice part about digital, it pulls it all together and then it's seamless, right? Walking around. I mean, from my vantage point where the area where I live, which is kind of, in the machine rooms and stuff, having a tablet with you and pulling up and scanning a QR code. I know that's even old technology now, and pulling up all the stuff on the digital twin for all the history of any piece of equipment, how it's operating, when the last person to do the work order was, huge benefit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Well, how do people get a hold of you and find out more about what you're doing, Ryan?
Find me on LinkedIn. I could shoot over my email, etc. But feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Sounds good. Last question for you. What does innovation mean to you?
Ooh, innovation. I think we have, so I live in the engineering world. I was grown up there. I think I'm pragmatic by nature, practical from the way I think of things. And innovation is hard by nature because, when we're using our professional engineering license and when we're looking at things to make sure or to ensure that something's going to work, typically you go with the tried and true method, something that's happened already that is probably going to work. And so for engineers, I think innovation, part of the reason it's been longer to adopt a lot of these technologies is because we've done it before and that's the way it works. But I think at the end of the day, those are some of the most dangerous things you can ever say, that this is the way we've always been doing it. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think innovation to me is just, kind of having an open mindset and trying to look at things from a different vantage point and seeing, both sides of some opportunity, whether it be, new technology or a new way to, work in commissioning and a new process that we've laid out. To me, it's just kind of eyes wide open, looking towards the future and continuous improvement.
Yeah, that's great. I have never thought of the engineering mind and how that kind of factors into the whole concept of innovation before. That's really interesting. I like it. It's a totally different mindset. Yeah. That's great.
It is. No one ever, I say this all the time. No one really ever calls me to thank me for a job well done. It's usually calling me to complain that something didn't, work out the way they intended. So the engineering mindset is always like, protective in nature, trying to make sure that, that everything is going to work out in the best way possible. So I truly think that's why innovation is so hard for a lot of engineering mindset people, because you're continually typically on the defensive, to make sure that everything's working well all the time. But again, that's going to hold everyone back from future improvements. So eyes wide open, my opinion.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. Well,
Yeah,
Ryan, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciated the conversation.
thanks for having me, Todd. Much appreciated.